The silence of the alien planet was broken only by the occasional hum of distant machinery, a sound that seemed to echo in the still air like a forgotten warning. The crash had left the ship in ruins, its twisted metal and fractured hull half submerged in the barren landscape. Smoke still curled from its wreckage, but it was the kind of smoke that promised nothing but a slow, fatting death, the kind that whispered of a failed mission, a doomed expedition. Tucked in the shadow of the wreck, a lone figure crouched low to the ground, his breath shallow and quick. Julian Steele, former soldier-turned-scavenger, eyed the ship with a mix of greed and disbelief. He had been through worse in his years of hunting, but this wreck was different. It was a prize beyond his wildest expectations. It had been 2 days since the crash, and now the wreck was abandoned, except for one detail, the occupant. He hadn't seen her awake yet, but he knew she was still inside. Her scent lingered in the air, faint but undeniable, an odd mix of alien flora and the metallic tang of blood. The ship was a marvel, unlike anything Julian had ever encountered. The technology was advanced, yes, but it was the spear that intrigued him the most. It was an ancient-looking weapon, made from materials that defied understanding, almost as if it belonged to a culture that had forgotten its own technology. He'd seen the glowing runes etched into the shaft when he passed by the ship earlier, a hint that something greater lay hidden inside. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the wreckage, Julian knew this was his chance. He had no idea who she was or where she came from, but her ship was a treasure trove of possibilities. If he could get inside, maybe he could salvage enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The weapon alone could fetch a small fortune. His fingers twitched with excitement, a mix of tension and anticipation. The cargo bay door was jammed, but he knew the weak spots, the places where the hull had buckled, leaving gaps. The key was timing. He needed to move quickly before she woke up and before anyone else showed up to claim what was rightfully his. Julian's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the wreck. His boots made no sound against the soft, sandy ground, but his mind raced through every possible outcome. His plan was simple: slip inside, grab the weapon, and be gone before the alien woman even realized he was there. He reached the side of the wreck and crouched down, slipping his hand into his bag to retrieve his tools. He pulled out a small cutting device, nothing fancy, but it was enough to make the work easier. He adjusted the blade and began slicing through the damaged metal. Sparks flew briefly, but he was careful. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention. Minutes passed. Sweat gathered on his forehead, but his focus never wavered. He needed the spear. The rest of the ship was nothing but scrap, but that spear, he had seen its power earlier. The way it gleamed, its hum like a silent promise. If it had the kind of energy he suspected, it could change everything. The metal bent under his pressure, and the panel slowly shifted open. Julian exhaled slowly, a grin spreading across his face. He was in. He took one final look over his shoulder, ensuring that no one was nearby, and then crept through the opening, careful not to make any noise. Inside, the ship was a mess of debris and twisted metal. But amidst the wreckage, something else stood out. A figure in the far corner of the cabin, slumped against the wall, covered in a strange, shimmering cloth. Her breathing was slow, almost imperceptible, and she was still unconscious. Her long, silver hair cascaded around her face, but Julian could see the marks of a warrior beneath the blood-stained fabric. The spear, though, he could see it clearly now. It was laying next to her, partially hidden by the wreckage, but still within arm's reach. Julian's eyes locked onto it, and for a moment he forgot everything else. His pulse quickened, his thoughts narrowing to a single goal, getting that spear. He moved toward it slowly, his boots silent on the metal floor. But just as his fingers brushed the cool surface of the spear's shaft, a low, guttural sound echoed from behind him. Julian froze. He turned, his body tensing instinctively. The woman hadn't moved, but there, standing just behind her, was something far more terrifying. The spear. It had risen on its own, hovering just above the ground. The runes on its shaft glowed faintly, pulsing with a strange energy. It trembled, then shot forward with the speed of a predator. Julian barely had time to react. The weapon's tip grazed his arm as it whizzed past, embedding itself in the wall behind him with a sharp, echoing clang. Before Julian could fully process what had happened, a voice echoed through the cabin, sharp and cold. "Touch it again, human, and I will not miss." The silence in the wreckage was deafening after the spear shot past him. Julian stood frozen, his heart thundering in his chest and his mind spinning with disbelief. The spear had moved on its own. It wasn't just a weapon, it was alive, or at least sentient. His eyes darted back to the woman, still slumped against the wall, her face obscured by a curtain of silver hair. Who are you? Julian's voice trembled, a mixture of fear and disbelief slipping into his words. The woman did not answer, but her eyes, now wide open, locked onto his with an intensity that made him take an instinctive step back. There was something primal in her gaze, something ancient that sent a cold shiver down his spine. She didn't move immediately, but the air around her seemed to hum with the same energy as the spear. The runes on the weapon flickered once more, its glowing light faint but unmistakable. The weapon was waiting, as if it could hear her thoughts, anticipating her next command. "Answer me," Julian repeated, his voice a little steadier now, but his hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, a small energy pistol that he kept tucked inside his jacket. It was a survivalist's weapon, not meant for offense, but it would at least buy him some time. The woman's lips twitched slightly, the only indication that she had heard him, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she lifted her hand slowly, her fingers grazing the hilt of the spear. "You should not be here, human," she said, her voice low but powerful, the words rolling from her tongue like they had been forged in the very earth she came from. It was a language Julian didn't understand, but somehow he knew she was not speaking to him alone. The spear seemed to respond, its hum growing louder as she gripped it firmly. Julian's pulse quickened. The spear was alive. There was no other explanation. His instincts told him to retreat, but his greed, the very thing that had driven him to this wreckage, pushed him forward. He needed to get away, but he couldn't leave empty-handed, not with such a prize within arm's reach. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice softer, more conciliatory. "I just need the weapon. There's so much more out there, this ship." "Is not yours," she interrupted, her voice suddenly more forceful. She pulled herself up from the wreckage, her movements graceful and precise despite the evident exhaustion in her posture. She was taller than him, almost a full head, her body long and lithe, like a hunter prepared to spring into action. Julian's hand tightened around the hilt of his pistol, his eyes flicking between her and the spear. "It's all mine now," he said, trying to bluff, though his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "You're the one who crashed here. Your ship is nothing but scrap metal now. You're alone." Her eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him with an intensity that made him feel like he was being peeled open layer by layer. "Not alone," she said, and in that moment, Julian understood she wasn't speaking about herself. From somewhere deep in the wreckage, a low rumble began growing louder with each passing second. The ground trembled beneath their feet, as though some massive creature was stirring to life. The woman's gaze flicked toward the source of the sound, and for the first time, Julian noticed the faintest glint of fear in her eyes. "Stay back," she warned, her hand still wrapped tightly around the spear. But there was something else now in her voice, something desperate. Julian felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this wreck as possible. He glanced around the wreckage, trying to find an escape route, but the ground was uneven, and there was nowhere to hide. He started to move back toward the entrance, but the spear flickered once more. The weapon was too close, too much of a temptation. Before he could stop himself, his hand darted forward, grabbing hold of the hilt. The woman's eyes shot to him, her pupils dilating in shock. The moment their fingers brushed against the spear, something shifted. The air around them crackled with energy. Julian felt a surge of heat rush through him, followed by a wave of nausea. His vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, he saw the woman's hand shoot out faster than he could react. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist, and with a single motion, she twisted him to the ground, the full force of her strength making him gasp for breath. "You should not have touched it," she said, her voice almost mournful as she stared down at him. The spear seemed to hum in response to her command, its energy vibrating in the air. The rumbling sound grew louder, and Julian could feel the ground shaking beneath them. It was no longer just a warning, it was an omen. Something was coming, something bigger than either of them. The woman didn't let go of his wrist immediately. Instead, she hauled him to his feet with surprising ease and shoved him in the direction of the wreck's entrance. "Get out," she commanded, the words sharp as a blade. "If you want to live, run. It's already too late for us." Julian hesitated, his mind racing. Something was wrong, something more than just the wreckage and the weapon. But there was no time to think about it. The ground trembled again, and a deep, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the wreck. I don't understand." Julian stammered, still holding the spear in his hand. "You will," she said grimly, her eyes turning back toward the wreckage. "But right now you need to run." Julian didn't wait for another warning. The woman had released his wrist with surprising force, and he wasted no time. He sprinted toward the wreck's entrance, heart racing as the earth beneath him trembled again. Every step he took was followed by a growl from the depths of the ship, a sound that reverberated through his bones and made him run faster. Behind him, the woman moved with a grace that was both terrifying and beautiful. She wasn't running, not in the way he was, but her every step was purposeful, as if she knew exactly where she needed to be. Her hand never left the spear's hilt, and Julian could see the runes on the weapon glow brighter with every tremor of the ground. "Keep moving," she barked, her voice cutting through the growing chaos like a blade. Julian glanced over his shoulder, but only for a second. What he saw made him wish he hadn't looked at all. A massive shape was emerging from the wreckage, a hulking figure draped in shadow, its form shifting as it broke through the twisted metal of the ship. Julian couldn't make out the details, but he didn't need to. The sheer size of it was enough to send a wave of terror through him. It wasn't just a creature, it was a force of nature. The ground seemed to crack under its weight as it lumbered toward them, its massive limbs dragging behind it like some broken mechanical beast. Its eyes, or what Julian could only guess were eyes, glowed a menacing red, like burning embers starring from the depths of a furnace. "Run," the woman shouted again, her voice now filled with urgency. Julian didn't hesitate this time. His legs moved faster, pushing him harder than they ever had before. He could hear the creature's growl intensifying as it drew closer, its monstrous presence now a palpable force in the air. It was almost as if the ship itself was alive, writhing and groaning under the weight of whatever had emerged from it. They reached the open ground just as the creature let out a deafening roar, the sound vibrating through the very air. Julian turned to see the woman still behind him, but she had stopped in place, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the approaching monstrosity. The spear was raised in front of her, the runes glowing more intensely now, casting eerie shadows on her face. "Go," she commanded, the words cutting through the air. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Julian's feet were frozen in place. He was caught between the instinct to survive and the pull of curiosity. His eyes met hers, and in that moment he saw something he hadn't noticed before, something behind the cold exterior. It was fear, not for herself, but for something else, for what was coming. The creature broke free of the wreckage in a single, powerful motion. It was like a giant, twisted combination of organic and mechanical parts, its limbs jagged and sharp, covered in a strange, glowing armor. It moved with an unnatural speed for something so large, and it wasted no time in lunging toward the woman. "No," Julian shouted, instinctively pulling his sidearm from its holster. His hands shook, but his focus sharpened. He fired once, then twice. The shots barely made a dent in the creature's armor, ricocheting off with a sound that was almost too loud to bear. The woman didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her spear raised high. She muttered something under her breath, a string of words that Julian couldn't understand, but somehow he knew they weren't meant for him. They were meant for the weapon. With a swift motion, she hurled the spear toward the creature. The weapon flew through the air like an extension of her will, its energy crackling as it tore through the space between them. The creature seemed to react to the movement, its body twisting to avoid the incoming weapon, but it was too slow. The spear embedded itself deep in the creature's chest, sending a shockwave of energy through the air. Julian watched in awe as the runes on the weapon flared brightly, the creature's body writhing in agony as it was pierced. The ground around them shook violently, and a low, rumbling cry echoed from the creature's throat. But instead of collapsing, the creature seemed to explode in a burst of energy. Its body shimmered and broke apart, scattering into a cloud of debris and sparks. The wreckage around them was caught in the blast, the shockwave sending Julian stumbling backward. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked from his lungs as the force of the explosion sent him skidding across the dirt. For a moment, everything went dark. When Julian came to, the first thing he felt was the sharp pain in his chest and the sound of distant humming. He groaned and pushed himself up, his vision blurry. The woman stood over him, her gaze fixed on the now silent wreckage. The spear was no longer in the creature. It was back in her hands, its runes glowing faintly. "Why didn't you run?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost curious. Julian rubbed his temples, trying to clear his head. I didn't know what else to do." She didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of understanding passed through her eyes. "Get up," she said, pulling him to his feet with ease. "You're not safe yet, there's more coming." Julian stumbled to his feet, his mind still racing. The creature was gone, but not defeated. There was something else lurking beneath the surface, something that the woman wasn't telling him. "Who was that?" Julian asked, his voice hoarse. "What is it? What was that thing?" "That was the Guardian," she said, her voice quiet but filled with an undeniable tension. "And it's only the beginning. You're in this now, human, whether you want to be or not." Julian's heart sank. He had thought he was just after a weapon, but now he was tangled in something much darker, and the true terror of this alien world was only beginning to unfold. The wind howled across the barren landscape, whipping dust and debris into the air. The wrecked ship, now little more than twisted metal and burning husks, seemed like a monument to failure. But the woman stood tall amidst the ruins, her eyes scanning the horizon, watching for the next wave of danger that could come from anywhere. Julian stood beside her, still catching his breath, his mind racing to keep up with the events that had unfolded. The Guardian, whatever it was, wasn't just a creature. It was part of something much larger, something that he couldn't yet grasp. And now, with the woman's cryptic words hanging in the air, he felt a deep, unsettling sense of inevitability. He had thought he could simply take the spear, leave the wreck, and be done with it. But now it was clear. He was in the middle of something far more dangerous, and no amount of running would be enough to escape it. "What was that thing?" Julian finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse from the explosion and his earlier panic. The woman turned to face him, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light, her eyes colder now, more focused. She was no longer the mysterious alien scavenger he had first encountered. There was something different about her, something that felt ancient, like she had seen worlds rise and fall. "The Guardian is the first of many," she said, her voice steady, almost calm in the face of the destruction. "It's not just an animal, it's a protector, a sentinel. But it's not here for us, it's here to keep something else from coming through." "Something else?" Julian asked, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her gaze flicking over the wreckage once more. Her hand never strayed far from the spear. "The Guardian's job is to guard the entrance. The ship, our ship, is just a gate, a place where they can cross. Those things, the Guardians, they don't protect us. They protect the world from what lies beyond." Julian stared at her, his confusion deepening. "What lies beyond? What are you talking about? What is all of this?" The woman hesitated, as if she were weighing something heavy on her mind. Then, with a heavy sigh, she met his gaze. "You're not just on any planet, human. You're on the planet we call Vorin, a world that was once home to an ancient race, one that created weapons like the spear you were trying to steal. But those weapons weren't just tools. They were meant to control the power of the gate, to harness the energies of another realm." Julian's mind whirled with this new information. A gate? To another realm? It sounded like something straight out of a sci-fi novel, but looking at the woman, he could see she wasn't joking. She believed it with every fiber of her being. "You said our ship," Julian's voice was cautious. "So, you're not from here?" "No," she replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I'm from a world far from here, a world that no longer exists, the gate. It wasn't meant for us, it was meant for something else. But when my people learned what was on the other side, they tried to close it. Too late. The creatures from beyond began to pour through, and with them the Guardians, protectors of the gate." "Your people tried to close it?" Julian asked, his mind still reeling. "But then, why are you here? Why did you crash?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the remains of the wreck, the haunted look in her eyes growing darker. "We tried, we failed. The gate is open, and it cannot be closed easily. We thought we had a way to seal it once and for all, but the device that would have worked—" She stopped herself and exhaled slowly. "It was destroyed, and so we crash." "Destroyed?" Julian's voice was rising now, his frustration building. "You're telling me that I almost got killed over a broken ship, over a weapon that's barely functional?" The woman's gaze turned sharp. "The weapon is functional, you don't understand. That spear is the key to closing the gate. You think it's just a tool. It's a weapon of unimaginable power. It's not just metal, it's a conduit to the other side. It was created by my people, designed to channel the very energy of the gate and force it to bend to our will. But she paused, her expression hardening. "I failed, and now the Guardians are hunting me." Julian stood still, his mind processing everything she had said. A weapon that could close a gate to another realm, Guardians that were hunting her, and a race that had already tried and failed to stop the coming darkness. What happens if the gate isn't closed? He asked, his voice suddenly tight with fear. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her back to him, her face clouded with sorrow. If the gate remains open, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the creatures that dwell beyond will pour through, they'll take everything, and nothing in this world will survive. The wind howled louder now, carrying with it the faintest echo of a growl in the distance. Julian felt his blood run cold. "We need to move," the woman said urgently, her hand reaching for his arm. "The Guardians may have been the first wave, but they won't be the last. If we don't act quickly, Vorin will fall, just like my people's world." Julian looked at her, his mind in chaos. She was right. This wasn't just about stealing a weapon. This was about survival. Survival not just for him, but for an entire planet, a planet he had stumbled onto by sheer chance. "Where do we go?" Julian asked, his voice finally steady. "Back to the gate," she said, "and this time we close it for good." The journey toward the gate was not as simple as Julian had hoped. Despite the urgency of their mission, the path ahead was shrouded in dangers both known and unknown. The woman, whose name Julian had yet to learn, led the way with a determined stride, her silver hair rippling behind her like the tail of a comet. The spear was still firmly gripped in her hand, its runes pulsing faintly with an ominous glow. Julian, on the other hand, was left to follow, his mind racing with the weight of what had been revealed to him. He was no longer just a scavenger hunting for valuable technology. He was now embroiled in something far greater, something that could change the course of history for not just the alien world of Vorin, but for the entire universe. The landscape of Vorin was stark, almost alien in its bleak beauty. The ground was cracked and uneven, jagged cliffs and spires of rock reaching toward the sky like the remains of some ancient war. Towering trees that appeared to be made of dark crystal lined the paths, their bark shimmering in the pale light. The atmosphere itself felt heavy, thick with a strange, otherworldly energy that Julian couldn't shake. He kept his distance as they traveled, observing the woman's movements. She was calm, unshaken by the weight of their mission, as though she had done this many times before. But her eyes spoke of things Julian couldn't yet understand. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, who had lost too much, and who was now fighting not just for herself, but for an entire world. "How far is it?" Julian finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. The woman didn't look back, but her voice was calm. "Not far. The gate is just beyond the ridge, but it won't be easy to reach." "Why?" Julian asked, unable to suppress his curiosity. "What's waiting for us?" She hesitated, and for the briefest of moments, Julian thought she might ignore the question entirely. But then her voice came again, low and strained. "They're already here," she said softly. "The Guardians are only the first line of defense, but others, much worse, will be waiting." Julian's stomach tightened at the thought. The creatures she had spoken of, the ones from the other side, they weren't just figments of her imagination. They were real, and they were coming. "How do you know so much about this?" he asked, a flicker of suspicion crossing his mind. "You keep saying my people, but who are they? What happened to them?" The woman stopped walking, and for the first time since they had met, she turned to face him. The hardness in her eyes softened, just for a moment before it hardened again. "My people were the architects of the gate," she explained, her voice quiet but laden with sorrow. "We built it to explore, to expand, to reach the stars. We had no idea what we were unlocking. We thought it would bring us power knowledge. But we were wrong. The creatures from beyond, the ones we called the Keepers, are not just predators. They are invaders, and they want nothing more than to consume everything in their path." "So your people, they built the gate and now they're gone?" Julian asked, trying to piece together the fragments of her story. The woman nodded, her face hardening once more. "Yes, we tried to close it. We thought we had found a way, but we were too late. The gate had already let them through. My people. They fought, but in the end they were overwhelmed. Now I'm the last one, the last of my kind." Julian felt the weight of her words sink into him. He had always prided himself on being resourceful, on surviving no matter the odds. But what she had faced, what she was facing now, was something he couldn't even comprehend. And yet here he was, following her because his own survival depended on it. "Why didn't you just leave?" Julian asked, his voice unsteady. "If you were the last of your people, why stay and fight?" Her gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Because I can't leave Vorin to die," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I couldn't leave the gate open for the Keepers to take over, and I couldn't let the Guardians, my people's creation, become the last line of defense. That's why I'm here, human. I have to close the gate before it's too late. Julian stared at her for a long moment, unsure of what to say. His instincts told him to stay focused, to stick to the plan, get the weapon, survive. But the weight of her words lingered, and for the first time since meeting her, he began to wonder if he was in over his head. "How can I help?" he asked, his voice filled with a new sense of resolve. She gave him a quick, calculating look, but there was no hint of mockery. "If we are going to make it, you need to trust me," she said firmly. "The weapon you tried to steal, it's not just a weapon, it's a key. It will unlock the core of the gate and shut it down, but you have to be ready. The keepers will try to stop us. They won't make it easy." Before Julian could respond, a low, rumbling sound interrupted the conversation. His heart skipped a beat. The ground beneath them vibrated, and a familiar growl echoed across the terrain. "They're here," the woman muttered. "We don't have time." Without another word, she took off, her pace quickening as she led him up the ridge. Julian followed, his breath catching in his throat as the air grew colder, the shadows deepening. He didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it. The presence of something terrifying was closing in. As they crested the ridge, Julian's eyes widened. Below them, nestled in a hollow in the earth, was the gate. It wasn't a door or even a portal as he had expected. Instead, it was a massive, intricate structure, an archway carved from the very stone of the planet, covered in ancient runes. A glowing energy field hummed at its center, swirling with an otherworldly light. And standing between them and the gate in the distance was the shape of something enormous. The keepers were coming. The glowing arch of the gate pulsed with an eerie energy, its runes shimmering like fireflies trapped within the stone. The energy field that surrounded it was unlike anything Julian had ever seen, swirling with colors that seemed to bend and fold upon themselves, as if it existed both within and outside of space. The very air around it felt charged, vibrating with an intensity that made his skin tingle. Standing between him and the gate, the keepers were beginning to take shape. Their silhouettes loomed in the distance, their massive forms shrouded in shadow. As they moved closer, Julian could make out their features, tall, humanoid figures with skin that seemed to ripple and shimmer like liquid, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were not human, not in any sense of the word. They were something otherworldly, something that didn't belong in this universe. The woman at his side tensed, her grip on the spear tightening. She glanced over at him, her eyes meeting his with a hard, determined gaze. "We don't have much time. The keepers are drawn to the gate's energy. If we don't close it now, they will overrun this world." Julian's heart raced as he took in the enormity of the situation. This was no longer just a matter of stealing a weapon. The very fate of Vorin, and perhaps more, was hanging in the balance. But the woman seemed different now, more resolute, and it only made him more determined to follow through. "How do we close it?" Julian asked, his voice steady but strained. The wind howled around them, a constant reminder that time was running out. She took a deep breath and pointed to the center of the arch. "The spear is the key. It needs to be placed directly at the heart of the gate. The energy inside it will activate the core, but it will also draw the keepers to it. We must act quickly." Julian nodded, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the spear in his hands, its hum vibrating through his body. It was the key, the only thing capable of closing the gate and stopping the invasion. But what price would it cost? He wasn't sure he could ever understand the kind of power that the spear contained, but he knew one thing: it was humanity's last chance. The ground trembled again, and the first of the keepers stepped into the clearing, its massive form towering over them. Its skin seemed to ripple like liquid metal, and its eyes burned with an intense predatory gleam. The others followed, their movements fluid, almost impossible to track with the naked eye. Julian swallowed hard. They were here, and they were going to make sure nothing stood between them and the gate. The woman raised her spear, and the air seemed to grow colder around them. "Stay close," she ordered, her voice firm. "If you want to survive, follow my lead." The keepers were getting closer, their long strides quickening, their eyes locked on the glowing energy of the gate. Julian's pulse quickened as they closed the distance, but he didn't hesitate. The woman moved with the fluidity of a dancer, every step calculated, every motion purposeful. She wasn't just leading him to the gate, she was preparing for the battle of her life. They reached the base of the gate, and the woman turned to face him, her expression hard. "When I activate the gate's core, it will draw all the energy here. The keepers will come after us, but we can't stop. You have to get the spear to the center of the arch." "What will happen when I do?" Julian asked, his voice tight. Either the gate will close or we will both die. She said it without hesitation, her eyes scanning the advancing keepers. Julian's throat went dry. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. There was no turning back now. The first keeper was almost upon them. It raised a clawed hand, and with a roar that sent chills down Julian's spine, it lunged. The woman acted instantly. Her spear flashed in the air like a bolt of lightning, slamming into the keeper's side with a crack that could be heard across the field. The creature screeched, stumbling back as the spear glowed with an intense light, its power surging in response to the woman's command. "Go," she shouted to Julian. "Now close it." Julian didn't wait for further instructions. He ran, the spear gripped tightly in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest as the keepers closed in. Their growls grew louder, more feral, and the air itself seemed to hum with their rage. He reached the center of the arch, his fingers shaking as he raised the spear high. The energy field surrounding the gate flared as the spear's runes matched the ones etched into the stone. Julian's breath caught in his throat as the ground beneath him began to shake. The woman's voice rang out, but it was drowned by the deafening sound of the energy rising from the gate. "Now, Julian, place it in the center." Julian's hands were slick with sweat, but he didn't hesitate. He thrust the spear forward, and the moment it made contact with the core of the gate, a blinding explosion of light erupted. The force of it knocked him off his feet, sending him flying backward into the dirt. The energy field surrounding the gate shattered like glass, the runes on the stone collapsing in on themselves. A deafening roar filled the air as the keepers screamed in fury. Julian could feel the ground rippling, the very fabric of the planet shaking beneath him as the portal to the other realm was forced shut. But it wasn't just the gate that was closing. It was the keeper's grip on Vorin. The creatures screeched one final time, their forms flickering like holograms before they dissolved into nothingness, consumed by the very energy they had sought to control. The woman staggered beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her eyes, once filled with determination, now held a quiet relief, but it was fleeting. The battle was over, but the cost had been great. Julian pushed himself up from the ground, his body aching, his limbs weak from the exertion. He looked at the woman, who had already turned her gaze back to the now silent gate. The energy that had once surged from it was gone, leaving only a hollow void where the portal had been. "It's done," he said, his voice low, almost in disbelief. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's never truly done. The keepers are gone for now, but there will always be others, and this gate. This place will always be a doorway. We'll have to keep watching." Julian's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to her, a new understanding settling over him. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a guardian, too, someone who understood the weight of what had been done and the responsibility that still lay ahead. "Then we keep watching," he said, his voice steady. "Together." The woman nodded, her gaze softening for the first time. Together. The sun began to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the alien landscape. The air, now free of the tremors and the heavy weight of the portal's energy, felt almost peaceful. The wind had died down, and the sky above Vorin seemed to be clearing for the first time in what felt like centuries. Julian stood beside the woman, his gaze fixed on the ruins of the gate. The energy that had once surged from it was now gone, and with it, the threat of the keepers had dissipated. The land was still and silent, as though the planet itself was taking a breath, relieved from the nightmare it had been enduring. But even in the quiet, Julian could sense that something had changed, not just in the world, but in himself. He wasn't just a scavenger anymore. He wasn't just trying to survive. He had helped stop an invasion, had fought alongside someone whose world had fallen, and he had found a new purpose. "Is it really over?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. The woman, standing tall beside him, didn't answer right away. Her gaze was still fixed on the horizon, her face softened by the early morning light, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She had done what she came to do, but Julian knew that for her, this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. "No," she said softly, "it's never truly over. The gate is closed, but there are always others who will seek to open it. There are always forces across time and space trying to find their way in. But now Vorin is safe for a while." Julian nodded, taking in her words. He wasn't sure he fully understood them, but he didn't need to. He had witnessed enough to know that she was right. This wasn't just about closing one gate. It was about vigilance, about watching for the next threat, the next wave that might try to breach the peace they had fought for. Then what happens now? He asked. She turned to him, her silver hair catching the light. There was no hesitation in her movements as she met his gaze. Now we rebuild, we protect, we watch. Together, Julian said, a quiet sense of resolve filling him. I'll stay if you'll have me. The woman's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. It was small, but it was there. You're already here, human, she said, her voice steady but warm. We'll need you. Julian let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. In that moment, he understood. The universe was vast, unpredictable, and full of dangers beyond comprehension. But what they had just done, the bond they had forged in the face of the impossible, was something stronger than any threat they could face. They had survived, and in surviving they had become something more. As they walked toward the remnants of the ship, the woman glanced up at the skis, her eyes narrowing slightly as if sensing something in the wind. But Julian didn't ask. He had learned not to question her instincts. Instead, he followed her side by side, knowing that their journey wasn't over, that the fight against the forces beyond the gate would continue, and that there would be more battles, more threats to face. But they would face them together. Where do we start? Julian asked, breaking the silence. The woman's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had come before, and everything that would come after. First we rebuild, she said, then we watch. As they disappeared into the distant horizon, the sun rising higher into the sky, Julian felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. For the first time since arriving on Vorin, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like a scavenger or an outsider. He felt like part of something bigger, something worth protecting. And as they moved forward, a new dawn rose not just for Vorin, but for him as well. The gate may have closed, but the journey had only just begun.